So the other day I was going through YouTube and I noticed that there's a bunch of videos out there dedicated to how to get a vintage bass sound. But videos that talk about the modern bass sound are practically non-existent. So I decided to make one. And there's a reason for this. I personally think that vintage bass tone sounds like vintage ass. I'm talking about that low fidelity pseudo 1960s bass sound that can only be had by using a bass with strings old enough to drink, played through some kind of old amplifier, and ironically, sounding a lot the way I did when I first started playing bass, and I didn't even know what I was doing. Now don't get me wrong, vintage tone has its place, and when I'm doing sessions, I know which projects I should utilize it on. Plus, there's certain genres like Motown and reggae, as well as styles like fast syncopated finger funk, that having a more vintage tone not only sounds better, but it sounds right. But for most other genres and styles, those low fidelity, rubbery vintage bass tones make me cringe. Electric bass sounded the way it did back then because that was back then. The bass guitar was still in its infancy. Record producers were still thinking upright even when they had an electric bass. By today's standards, the recording equipment was primitive, and the playback systems were also primitive. Records that were labeled high fidelity or hi-fi should have really been called, "That's the best we could do right now, dude fidelity." Now, as the 60s and 70s moved on, technology improved in both recording gear and the playback systems. Improved technology meant higher fidelity, and the bass guitar itself was still evolving as an instrument all of its own. Round strings were allowing more bass harmonic structure. P-bass players were modding their instruments to have a J pickup added at the bridge for improved note articulation, and the PJ pickup format was born. Basses with active electronics became more popular, and then the 80s came along, which brought us digital recording, which allowed for unprecedented fidelity and detail. And this is when I started playing bass, and I enjoy the evolution of the bass guitar and its fidelity. And I still do. So basically, I have been running away from vintage tone as fast as I can all my life. And I know it wasn't just me, because back then, you practically couldn't give away a P-bass with flat wounds. And the only players using vintage Fender Bassman amps were blues guitar players. Now, I've been playing bass a very long time, and I've seen trends come and go. And about 2010 or so, the retro trend came in. All of a sudden, the music industry was reaching out for older vintage sounds. And you can hear it in songs by John Mayer, L. King, and Portugal the Man, just to name a few. And trends being what they are, a lot of bass players started jumping on the bandwagon. Players were getting rid of their active basses and going for passive ones. They were taking off their round wound strings and putting on flat wounds. They were looking for the oldest amps that they could find, and if the cabinet didn't have a high frequency driver, the better. Me, I just scratched my head as I watched this unfold around me. Just because something is vintage doesn't necessarily mean it's better. I mean, Grandma uses a smartphone now because she can't get Facebook on her old rotary dial telephone. And me, I'd rather play a modern video game than try to entertain myself with a stick and a hoop like they did in the 1920s.
Is this supposed to be fun?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, let me know when the fun starts.
Now, just to clarify, I'm mainly talking about modern and vintage tone, because modern tone has more to do with how you set up your instrument and gear than the age of the gear itself. There's a lot of classic gear out there that is perfectly capable of getting you great modern tone. For example, if you're a rock, heavy rock, or punk player, if you happen to have a classic P-bass and you set it up to use round wound strings and you use a pick and you play it through a classic SVT, well, that's one of the earliest examples of modern rock bass tone, and it's a damn good one. If you play funk, contemporary jazz, or contemporary praise and worship music, Marcus Miller's bass tone is probably a great reference. Which brings us to the actual question, what is modern bass tone? To a lot of people, it just means having a bass tone with a lot of high frequencies on it. But really, it's about enhancing the fidelity all up and down the spectrum from low to high, and bringing out all the detail and nuances of the bass string. The end result is a bass tone that's not too dissimilar to the low notes of a piano. To get modern tone, there's two basic ingredients every bass needs to have. The first is the setup, and I usually set my basses up with fairly low action to maximize the resonance of the instrument. In other words, I want the bass to be fairly audible without even plugging it in. The second key factor is strings. Now, different players have different opinions about strings for modern tone. My opinion is I like to use fresh and new as possible round wound strings. All the zing and brightness doesn't really bother me because I've been using new round wounds forever, and controlling that zing and brightness actually becomes part of my technique. Some players prefer the strings to be a little bit broken in to take the edge off, and there's also pressure wound strings, which have a round wound type of sound, but they feel like flat wounds. So you'll just have to play around to see what you like. So while the action setup and the bass strings are prerequisites to get almost any bass a modern sound, there are other options that will help enhance the modern sound. The first is pickups and pickup positioning. Now you'll get different opinions about this too, but from my experience, I find that a bass with 2 pickups, one in the P bass position to get bottom end without being too boomy, and one toward the bridge for articulation and enhanced high end response, usually always works the best for me. But there are other basses like Stingrays and ATKs that have a single pickup in this position that deliver excellent modern tone. So once again, it's up to you to experiment and hear what you like. Option number 2 is active electronics. Now, as I stated earlier, having a low-action resonant setup and fairly new round-wound strings are going to give most basses a modern tone, even passive ones. But active pickups and active electronics bring out even more harmonic structure and detail. And active pickups and active preamps are about as diverse as basses are themselves. So once again, you're just going to have to experiment to see what you like. Active EMG pickups are always a great option, but there's preamp companies like Audier that make very good preamps. I just recently put one in my 1980 Fender Precision Special. And there are many production model basses that seem like they are naturally great at getting a modern tone. And some of these lines even have budget-conscious models, like Ibanez Soundgear's Jackson Spectra series and Yamaha's TRBX series. So why am I a champion of modern tone? For me, the bottom line has always been flexibility. You see, I play in a lot of variety band situations, and these bands usually cover songs from a wide range of decades and genres. If a bass is bright and stringy, I can tone it down as needed to sound more classic. But I can't make a lower fidelity vintage sounding bass sound modern because that brightness and articulation isn't there to begin with. There's a lot of YouTuber bass players like myself who have a lot of experience, and we also have accumulated a bunch of different basses over the years. But I do try to keep in mind that there are a lot of players out there that just have one bass. And if they're looking to play in variety band situations to make money or be able to cover a wide array of genres for hired gun work, I'm hoping a video like this one will raise points for the person to consider. I'm Rib13. Thanks for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel. As always, a big thank you to my Patreon supporters, Derek and Joe, and I'll see you next time.